new to programming in general. Basically how you want to approach this is you want to first of all take a look at the variable names, and that sort of gives you a clue, hopefully, into what it relates to and what it does, right? So if we look at this, like you see there's like a collection of these, right? There's one called Aki, one called blue, pink, yellow, white, box, circle, dash. And if we open this up again, like you sort of have a clue of what that is, because we know that when we tap the number keys, we actually saw all of these symbols, right? So we saw Aki, which is this, me, I guess. And we've seen this circle, right? The circle here. And you'll see that the cursor, the box in the background, is yellow. So that's probably a yellow tile. This is the box. It may not really look that much like a box, but it sort of gives us these connections that we could use. And we're sort of like taking these clues and like solving it within our heads, you know? And this is like a dash. And you'll notice that when we press enter, it actually gives us a little bit of a pink box there. So we know that that's probably pink. We don't see blue here yet. And we'll see that later, most likely. It probably will be something that you encounter later within this game, if it's something that already exists. And something that's really kind of cool about that is if you do have something like a variable that's not being used, like you can call this test, right? So since we are in an IDE, the IDE will be smart enough to sort of tell you that, hey, this is something that you're not using at the moment, and it gives you a little bit of warning. Sometimes if you're doing something that it deems to be really wrong, it'll actually give you an error. But in this case, the warning is just sort of a heads up to tell you like, hey, it looks like you're doing this, but are you sure that's what you want to be doing? Because if you have like unused variables, obviously you're just wasting space. It doesn't cost that much for a computer, but to keep like an empty variable, but it sort of lets it know that maybe you're doing something wrong, because usually when people make variables, they intend to use them somewhere in their code. And so if you're not using that, then maybe like something in your logic is wrong, or like you just have leftovers that you need to clean up. So things like that, the IDE is like really useful to like be able to tell you what's wrong there. We know that blue is being used because it's not it doesn't have like this little outline, and Visual Studio isn't yelling at us about it. So we know that it's used somewhere, and what we can do is actually like copy and paste this into the find box, which you can do like Control F. It's like the same if you as if you are on a browser, and we can just take a look at it, right? So you'll see that the second thing that you can use to give you an idea of like what code is accomplishing in any project is you can actually read the comments that whoever wrote it left for you, and hopefully like they did a good job in leaving something that is coherent. Sometimes that won't be the case, and sometimes people won't leave comments at all. So even if it's something that you're writing for yourself, if you come back and look at the code, you're gonna forget honestly what things are most of the time. So be kind to future you, or whoever is going to be reading your code. Leave slightly coherent comments so they know what's going on and they can find out really easily, right? And so we can see here that we're loading all of these variables that we've seen before, and we don't actually need to know what these are right now. You don't need to know why this works or like what it's actually doing. We just need to sort of know the general context of it, right? So if I'm someone coming in not knowing what this code actually means, like I'll take a look and it says retextures, right? And so this is probably, it means it's loading in all these images into our game so that we can draw them later. And we can keep going down the list to see where else blue is referenced, right? And then this line, like a lot of this is English. You can see that it looks like, oh, this is actually, it's drawing the grid. And so the blue tile will probably appear somewhere in the grid. And how do we find out when it appears in the grid? Well, it says if t equals x, right? That's one of our conditions that we learned before. Let's take a look at what t is now, right? So we know that during this condition, if t equals x, so t must be a character. And you can actually see that it's up here, right? Character t equals level at R and C, right? And so if we actually go to level, so we're sort of like following the rabbit hole down of what this actually is. And you can see that level is used in a bunch of different places, but let's find where it's actually declared, where the variable is made, and where we tell the computer, hey, level, this is a space for some data that we're gonna put. And it looks like it's here, right? And haha, luckily, whoever wrote this commented it for us. So it seems like this is a 2D array of characters that represents each tile on the map with H rows and W columns. And look, it's actually really conveniently there too. We can see that W equals 10. It's just an integer, right? It's an integer value. It's a constant integer value, which means it's read only. That means that we can't change it after we run the code, right? So this is always going to be the same. And it looks like that actually says it's the expected width of the level in tiles, right? And so I did tell you that we are making a level editor, and this is actually the file that you can take a look at. It's called level.txt, and that's sort of what we're loading in as a representation of what the level looks like. So this program, it seems like, is mostly going to be taking this from this file, right, with all these different tiles, right, the dash, P, O, X, and space. So those seem like the different types of tiles that we had. And we saw that in the if condition down here, right? P, O, X, dash. And it seems like it's going to be drawing that onto the screen. And then you're going to be able to place tiles on the screen, right? And then save it back to level.txt. So that's essentially what we're going to be making today. This version of the code doesn't have the logic to read from the file yet, so that we're actually drawing what's inside this text file. And it doesn't have the logic yet to save it to the actual file. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. And you can see how like we're sort of like following this rabbit hole down each of these variables and like sort of filling out the gaps in knowledge that we have, right? Like we can keep going down. Look, we have the height and width already. And this sort of is a really good place to start. So we've hit that point where we can start like working backwards towards like where we started, right? Because now this doesn't actually reference another variable. I know it can get pretty long with like you're following one thing to another to find out what it actually does and what it actually is, right? And so this is a really good point because now we stopped at a read only variable, a constant variable that's never going to change, and we know it's a number. And like already we can sort of see like it's a 10 by 10 grid, right? Because that's the width and the height. And if we take a look at the level.txt file that we have, if we actually count this, like we can correlate it in our minds, even if we don't know what the code does, even if I'm not here to explain it to you, right? So you can actually see like this first line, well, actually we have like 10 lines, right? So that's already 10. That's probably what the height is referring to. And then you can count the number of spaces in the first line, or the number of characters in the first line, if you will. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Right? So that's the width. And obviously like this type of thing you can change the number of. And I do encourage you actually, like if you are working on new code and you're not quite sure what a certain variable does, just change it and see like what that actually does, right? So if I change this to like 5, right? 5 by 2, let's see what that does. First of all, like we can load this up and just see what's changed, right? And you'll notice that like before we could move all the way across the map, but now we're sort of constrained to this 5 by 2 grid, right? And so that sort of gives you the clue that yeah, it is height and it is width. Even if you didn't have that comment in here about the expected width and height in tiles, try it out and then you'll know what it does, right? And so that's a really important habit to get into when you're coding. So now that we have that, we can revert it back. We obviously don't want to change it yet if we don't know why we're changing it. We have no reason to change it. So we're going to leave that as it is now, 10 by 10, especially because the file looks like it's going to be 10 by 10 tiles anyway. And so now that we have that, we can go back to what led us to this in the first place, which is this 2D array of characters, right? And we did cover 2D arrays in our last class, but I know this is going to look a little bit different to you because the last time we actually did this in JavaScript, and what we're using now is actually called C#. But it's going to look really familiar to you anyway. Like, honestly, all of these lines, even though you haven't seen objects before and you haven't seen, we haven't explained functions or classes, like this looks really familiar to what we did in JavaScript, right? And that's because both of these are basically C-style languages. And as I said in previous lessons, like it really doesn't matter what language you're using as long as you have these sort of core concepts down. And especially like the reason I was teaching the previous lessons in like JavaScript and C++ is because all of these languages look very similar to each other. Like you could obviously take these concepts and apply them to other languages like Python, or like I guess even Python is like slightly C style, but you can apply it to like Lisp, a bunch of different things, and they're gonna look really different from this. But the knowledge that you gain and the fundamentals that you build from this are the things that are really important. Like you can Google syntax, you can Google how things are done in languages, and once you have like these sort of core fundamentals, you could probably pick up any language and be able to figure out how to do things in them. And so that's sort of a really cool thing about code. It's like you're not learning how to write in a specific language. You're learning how to write in general and how to figure out how to write if you don't know how to write, you know? It's kind of like if you are learning to ride a bike, you're not learning to ride that specific bike. And even though there are differences between like what mountain bikes and city bikes, or like it's at its core like pretty similar, right? You're gonna be able to learn, or you're gonna be able to pick one up and just ride it, even if you don't have all the techniques necessary for like the specific bike that you have. Maybe you need to like lean a certain angle, or like sit a certain way to be able to get the most ergonomic use out of that bike, to get the fastest speed out of that bike. But like, you know how to ride the bike. That's all that's important, right?